All right, good evening to all. We'll get started, and those of you who aren't quite yet seated will find your ways to seats. My name is John McGoldrick, and I'm going to start this evening with what used to be called a preview of coming attractions, but just to encourage you all to attend the next Friends Talk, which is next Wednesday, May 1 at 6 o'clock with refreshments before then at 5:30. Diva Woodley, who is the Friends of the Institute member in the School of Social Science and also associate professor at the New School for Social Research in New York, will give the Friends Forum that night. Her title is Changing Politics, New Issue Acceptance, and the American Way. She compares the trajectory of two contemporary social movements we're all familiar with, the fight for marriage equality and the struggle for a living wage, and what it takes for such movements to succeed, which should be very interesting, and if you're interested in starting a movement, you might get some tips. This evening, I have the distinct pleasure to introduce Robert Darnton, the Pforzheimer University professor and director of the University Library at Harvard. Many here know Bob. Indeed, this is very much a homecoming because his ties to the Institute and to the community are very deep and broad. He lived here, of course, and his 3 children were launched into life from Princeton High School, and his daughter even taught at the Institute's Crossroads preschool. So he's one of us. He is a much honored historian. He taught at Princeton for 39 years, where he became the Shelby Cullom Davis Professor of European History. During that time, among other things, he was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship and served as president of the American Historical Association. Later, he received the Chevalier of the Legion of Honor from France and the National Humanities Medal from President Obama. In 2007, he moved to one of Harvard's major faculty chairs, to the joy of all of us who call that place home, where he has continued his highly varied academic interests in cultural history, the history of 18th century France, and the history of the book, in which he is recognized as a pioneer. At the same time, he planned and led Harvard's massive and highly successful transformation of its huge library system, while also taking roles in the ongoing changes and challenges of digitalization of libraries globally. Indeed, his lead piece in the next to last issue of the New York Review of Books, entitled The National Digital Library is Launched, is well worth reading if you haven't heard about that. We may have some time for questions later about digitalization, although that's not tonight's topic. One of the striking aspects of Robert's prolific historical production is its stunning variety. Not only does his oeuvre treat standard historical subjects in new and entirely creative ways, but his exploration of the unusual, even the outré, is both scholarly and delightful at the same time. I cannot resist mentioning just a few of his many titles. The Great Cat Massacre and Other Episodes in French Cultural History. George Washington's False Teeth, An Unconventional Guide to the 18th Century. The Devil in the Holy Water, or The Art of Slander, from Louis XIV to Napoleon. I've got to read that one. And just one more, mesmerism and the end of the Enlightenment. This man knows how to write titles. To cheer yourself up on a gray, rainy day, simply do as I did and read a list of the titles of Robert's many reviews for the New York Review of Books. They're simply wonderful. This evening, we are treated to one of Robert's many interests. He calls it blogging now and then, 250 years ago. And so, without more from me, I ask you to join me in welcoming Robert Darnton.
Thank you. Thank you, John. I am delighted to be here. I've spent so many happy hours in this room hearing wonderful debates, other hours in the restaurant, eating wonderful meals. I've even spent wonderful hours skating on the pond outside. It's a great place, the Institute, and I'm honored and delighted to be back. What I'd like to talk about today is to begin with some general remarks about what we are all fascinated by, namely this strange new world of the digital, and then to try to provoke you with a very far-fetched parallel between blogging today and, well, you'll see what was going on in the 18th century. Many people today, of course, feel that they are going through a revolution every bit as revolutionary as that in the time of Gutenberg. I would even argue it's more revolutionary. But what is a revolution? Well, a lot of ink has been spilt about that subject, and I'll spare it to you. But I think I can speak for many when I say that the feeling of going through this enormous change in the modes of communication isn't comfortable. The ground seems to shift beneath our feet as the landscape changes before our eyes. It's something like driving through a heavy rain and trying to see beyond. Everything gets blurred, and you ask yourself, where are we going when these pellets hit the windshield? What is the future, and how can we make sense of it all? Well, what I propose is to begin by acknowledging what you could call the fragmentary character of information in general, not just today, but in the past. Hundreds of years before the internet, early modern variety, believe it or not, of blogging. And it kept a vast public of readers fascinated with the kind of material that shows up today in the Drudge Report and the Huffington Post. That is scandal. Now, of course, a lot of other material also circulated through the channels of communication in the 17th and 18th centuries. I want to concentrate on gossip mongering, despite its seeming triviality, because I think it can tell us a lot about the media, the messages they transmitted, and the way information systems operated. I mean, that's the goal, anyhow, of this kind of research. Moreover, gossip is not as trivial as you might think. Consider this observation by Stendhal, no less. Quote, "Just think that what fools despise as gossip is, on the contrary, the only history that, in this affected age, gives a true picture of a country. We need to see everything, experience everything, make a collection of anecdotes," end quote. Stendhal. Now, he was using an 18th century concept of anecdote, which is very different from our own, as I will begin to explain. But you can, I think, take it as true that people were fascinated by anecdotes in the 18th century, In fact, it was a time when, according to Louis-Sébastien Mercier, one of the great observers of contemporary life, said, we live in a time of anecdotomanie, a mania for anecdotes. Well, I'd like to get into that in a minute, but first, I would like to even turn back beyond the 18th century and introduce you to someone many of you know, the greatest gossip monger of all time, the ur-grandfather of the whiz kids at Perez Hilton and Gawker, namely Pietro Aretino. Here he is in a splendid portrait by Titian. It's in the Frick. Titian actually painted 3 portraits of Aretino, whom he knew very well. Aretino rose to fame in the early 16th century from the sonnets that he composed and pasted on the statue of someone called Pasquino, which was located off the Piazza Navona in Rome. No one, even today, knows who Pasquino was. The statue is very primitive. You see it here on the left. It's still there in Rome, and you can see bits of paper pasted on it below. So from the early 16th century to today, I saw it only about 6 months ago, Romans love to put bad poems about bad politicians underneath Pasquino. And so this has given birth to an actual genre, the pasquinate, pasquinade, the pasquinade. It's one that involves originally verse, very scandalous, nasty verse. Aretino developed it in the great election of 1522 to choose a new pope. We've been through this recently. In 1522, it was rather different. Each cardinal, of course, was fighting all of the other cardinals. Aretino was paid off by the Medici, and his job was to slander all of the other cardinals so they would not get elected. And he did such a good job of it that all of Rome was laughing at the ridiculous characteristics of these cardinals. Whoring was nothing. The worst one, actually, if I remember correctly, was he's a mama's boy. Anyhow, my point is simply that this genre, the pasquinade, is still alive and well, and people have been posting up little bits of paper on public places ever since. On the right, you see students during the May-June 1968 uprising in Paris doing really the same thing that Aretino had done before then. So I would argue that many current graffiti descend from Aretino, and they illustrate the main theme that I would like to develop, namely that information comes in fragments. And these fragments embed themselves in whatever niches are provided by the surrounding environment. The most effective niches today are websites, and the modern equivalent of a pasquinade is a posting on a blog. Now, the parallel, of course, is not perfect. In fact, it's outrageously anachronistic. But I'd like to use it as a provocation for making some general remarks about the history of books. I should also, of course, acknowledge that a lot of websites contain many kinds of information that are not scandalous, and many blogs do specialize in scandal mongering, so I'm not talking about absolutely everything. But there is a great deal of this stuff circulating on the internet. So I'd like to choose a few examples, taking the ones from the 18th century from scandalous pamphlets like this one, The Iron-Plated Gazetteer, or, and the subtitle is significant, Anecdotes, Scandalous Anecdotes about the Court of France. Here is a typical posting from a gossip blog, thesuperficial.com, quote, you may not be able to read the subtitle, I'll read it out. Carrie Prejean is living in sin. Now, that's all, just one sentence like that. It's a sort of a flash. It's true that the picture conveys a message beyond the power of the printed word, but consider the caption in isolation. It's very short, just one sentence, except for the ironic kicker at the end, which is burn them. But the picture does convey a message beyond the power of the printed word. Now, I can't give you exactly similar examples from the 18th century, but occasionally you would find different sorts of one-liners from the 18th century like this. So if you can't read the translation, it runs as follows. It is said that Mademoiselle Romand, a notorious actress, will marry Monsieur de Croixmare, governor of the École Militaire, who will take 6 aides-de-camp from the first class of his school to perform the conjugal duty in his place, end quote. So again, it's a kind of a news flash in one sentence. And it's interesting, too, because there's an implicit reference to recycling information from another medium. In this case, rumor, what the French then called the on dit. One says that. Now, the comparison maybe doesn't work as well as it might because the French text lacks pictures. Occasionally, okay, well, I've missed I had a picture from the 18th century for you, but somehow it got lost. It shows George III as a young man being led by his nose by his mother, while the Earl of Bute makes an obscene gesture toward her. I mean, it's the kind of thing that might not seem shocking to you, but in 18th century England, it was very shocking. So what we're talking about are the kinds of things in the 18th century that would appear in PerezHilton.com, which ridiculed, as you see it here, the mayor of Las Vegas when he was running for governor. Sex and politics provided inexhaustible material for ancient anecdotes as well as modern blogs. Public figures always provided targets, even when the reports were about trivial incidents. I mean, here's a political blog from theall.com. It makes fun of stalwarts from the British Labour Party when it was last in power by means of just a 2-sentence anecdote about a minor accident. A Labour MP got banged up by a cow, which supposedly illustrated the fact that everyone, even animals, had come to detest British politicians during the last years of the Labour Party. Here's a similar and even shorter report of a supposed accident, which concerns a former foreign secretary of Louis XV. Quote, "It has been confirmed that Monsieur the Duc de Praslin, having bitten his finger while chewing on his nails, had fallen into a state of self-poisoning, which carried him off within 24 hours. So this anecdote would fit on Twitter as a tweet. I had some verse that I could have shown you satirizing Sarah Palin, which is exactly like some verse that was satirizing politicians in the 18th century. But I thought I would skip over it to show you this famous picture of Scott Brown. It appeared on a blog before his election to the Senate, and it again illustrates the idea of sex and politics going together. The rakish side of politics is especially hot today, but it was hot in the 18th century as well. Here is if you want to call it that, the gigolo politico theme that you see with Scott Brown. it appears in an attack on Marie Antoinette from a London journal, and it is 1 paragraph long. It figures in a column of paragraphs, each one self-sufficient, unrelated to the others, and outrageously scandalous. So it's about her supposed love affair with a visiting British aristocrat. The scandal surrounding Representative Anthony Weiner, of course, gave bloggers a field day, and it may revive since, as you know, he's now running for mayor. As you remember, he sent obscene photographs of himself to woo a woman on the web soon after his wife became pregnant. The Weiner blogging isn't very different from paragraph-length slanders from the 18th century. And of course, it involves a lot of punning on his name. It's sort of scandal-mongering as a dirty joke. But there were dirty jokes like that in the 18th century. Here is one of them. The Duke of ... surprised his wife in the arms of his son's tutor. She said to him with the impudence of a courtier, "Why weren't you there, monsieur? When I don't have my squire, I take the arm of my lackey," end quote. So sex among public figures provides endless material for bloggers today, as it did in the 18th century, and I will spare you any reference to the endless blogging about the man who did not become president of France. This one is about a Republican politician who was running, had a notorious affair, and the bloggers just were all over him. But there's a similar one from the 18th century when, of course, most of the slander is aimed at the aristocracy and the clergy. Quote, "The Prince de Conti was wounded," that is, contracted venereal disease, "by a little girl known as the little F ... He bears a terrible grudge against Guérin, his surgeon," that is, the medical inspector of his mistresses. So it's not terribly different from what existed in the 20th century. There are endless parallels about the private lives of public figures 2 centuries apart. So here you see a sex star in his old age today. And here is a similar article about sex among seniors in 18th century Paris. Quote, "It is said that the curate of Saint-Eustache was caught in flagrante delicto with the deaconess of the Sisters of Charity in his parish, which would be greatly to their honor since they are both in their 80s, end quote. I could go on and on citing examples, but I don't want to mislead you by overdoing the comparisons. Historians can always select evidence to make the present look like the past. And by doing so, they can create a specious sense of continuity. Plus ça change, et plus c'est la même chose. And my answer to that is non. I am not arguing that 21st century blogs are the same thing as 18th century anecdotes, or that history is repeating itself through the internet. On the contrary, I want to point out the differences underlying the similarities in order to understand something about information. Not only its fragmentary character, but the way those fragments fit together. Scandal, of course, has always existed, and reports about it have often come in bits and pieces. Furtive remarks, scribbles on scraps of paper, images on iPads. But these tidbits of information do not exist in isolation. They circulate in communication systems, or if Clifford Geertz were here, he would say cultural systems, which are shaped by the currently available media and are particular to time and place. Blogs and anecdotes warrant study, I think, because they can help us understand how information operates. Now, I could go on and on about bloggers today. There's actually some very interesting sociological study of them, but let's skip that so that we can concentrate more on the 18th century where the fun is. Now you see something much less sexy than Scott Brown, but it's very interesting, and I would like you to pause on it just to get the sense of the page design of a newspaper from London in the 18th century. It's utterly different from newspapers today. There are no headlines, there are no bylines. Each paragraph is different from the other paragraphs. They have no connection whatsoever. No one is writing a story, as newspaper reporters describe it today, they're just doing paragraphs. And that's quite typical for any journal that you would find in London in the 18th century. So the question is, where did they get their news and how was it actually presented? Well, until 1771, when reports on parliamentary debates were tolerated, they weren't allowed, reporters weren't allowed into Parliament at all. And as you probably know, Samuel Johnson became famous for just making up speeches that were supposedly said in Parliament. And he wrote them so well that the MPs cultivated him. They thought this was great. So Parliament, the debates in Parliament took place in another world until 1771. And then you've got the opening up of a kind of public sphere in London. But the newspapers didn't have anything like real reporters or editors. They really didn't have much of a professional staff at all. In fact, you should imagine a tiny shop with a composing frame and a composer setting type on the marble, paragraph by paragraph. People would come in and they would hand him a scrap of paper, or sometimes there was a special slit in the door, and he would look at it and just set it in type. These were paragraph men, and the paragraph men were in effect the reporters, but of course they often had their own axes to grind. Where did they get their news? Well, in coffee houses. And I show you this picture and the next one. Well, you can see two of them. My point is, in a typical picture of a coffee house in London from the 18th century, you see bits of paper everywhere. People are scribbling. So they exchange gossip. They write it down on bits of paper in the form of one paragraph, and then they take it to a shop where the compositor puts it into type, and it appears the next day as news. It's a very interesting business, and what you see happening is a transmission of oral communication into written communication, scraps of paper, and then into print. Now, during the early 18th century, most London newspapers limited themselves to what they called the freshest advices. That is anodyne subjects, such as shipping news and that kind of thing. But a new tone of outspokenness crept into English newspapers, especially the papers of the west side of London, during the Wilkite agitation of the 1760s, and a new variety of scandalous journalism took root with the founding of a paper called the Morning Post in 1772 by a character who I find utterly fascinating. His name was Reverend Henry Bate. Here's a printing shop which is very accurate in all of its details, except, of course, the printers are devils, And if you could see the exact details, they're printing scandal all over the place. So this is the kind of news produced by the Reverend Bate, and here he is in a caricature which was getting across his scandalous nature. He was really a clergyman. He was chaplain to Lord Lyttelton, but he specialized in scandal mongering, and he mongered scandal, attacking his victims so outrageously that they would demand satisfaction, challenge him to fights and duels. And according to one contemporary, they asked to fight him with sword and fist and pistol, and then he demolished them in a series of fights, many in Hyde Park Corner, because he was a bruiser, this guy, and then he would write it up the next day in the newspaper, and it would sell all the better. So the Reverend Bruiser became a real force in the creation of a new kind of journalism in London. Bate eventually quit the Morning Post, and then he founded a rival and equally outrageous journal, the Morning Herald, on his own. The Post hired an even more vitriolic editor to fight back. That editor was also a clergyman, the Reverend William Jackson, who was known as Dr. Viper for the extreme, and I'm quoting now a contemporary, the extreme and unexampled virulence of his invectives in that species of writing known as paragraphs, end quote. So these two men of the cloth, the Reverend Bruiser and Dr. Viper, slugged it out in their newspapers, making scandal and sensationalism a staple ingredient of English journalism. This is, I believe, where Murdoch and the News of the World began. Well, that's a quick glimpse at the paragraphs and the kind of scandal that was very popular in England. Let's now, I'll show you a detail. On the bottom right, you can see he's got one foot on the Bible and another on a box with a little slit in it where you would put in a paragraph, and it's the devil who has put the Bible under his foot. So they had a lot of fun, the English, with the Reverend Bruiser Bate. But what was scandal mongering like if you cross the channel and you go into France? It usually took the form of an anecdote, and that is a term that one meets everywhere in underground illegal literature, such as I've tried to calculate bestsellers from 18th century France. In my calculations, one comes in number 2. It's anecdotes about Madame la Comtesse du Barry. So this stuff is selling like hotcakes. But what did anecdote mean? Here, if you look it up in a typical entry in the dictionary of the Académie Française, it says, let's see, I'm trying to quote it, a particular circumstance of history, which had been omitted or suppressed by previous historians. And then it gives examples. The first example it cites is from the anecdotes of Procopius. I'll get to Procopius in a minute. Samuel Johnson produced a similar definition in his dictionary, quote, something yet unpublished, secret history. It is now used after the French for a biographical incident, a minute passage of private life, end quote. But there's no suggestion that anecdotes are untrue, as we tend to think when we talk about anecdotal evidence as evidence that is probably not true. Diderot's Encyclopédie elaborated on this definition in a way that brought out its implications. This word is used in literature to signify the secret history of facts that happened in the inner cabinet or courts of princes and in the mysteries of their politics, end quote. A very interesting definition, the mysteries of their politics. Politics in the 18th century was considered a mystery or a secret that took place in privy or secret cabinets, Privy Council, Conseil Privé, Geheimrat. And therefore, by its nature, politics should be hidden from the public. It belonged to this secret sphere of activity known as the Arcane Imperii, or in French, le secret du roi. Now, the references to Procopius, the Byzantine historian of the 6th century AD, those references crop up everywhere. And the article in the Encyclopédie explains why. In his formal histories, Procopius covered the main characters, the Emperor Justinian, his consort Theodora, his great general Belisarius, with praise. But he also wrote secret histories known as anecdota, which exposed the sordid private lives of the same people and made their personal depravity serve as an explanation for the decline and fall or decadent state of the Roman Empire. To writers and readers of the 18th century, therefore, anecdotes expressed a Procopian strain in history, the true story of the secret elements that determined the course of events. In practice, that often meant revelations about the private lives behind public affairs. Dozens of private lives, they almost always begin with the same title, vie privée. They spread throughout the 18th century, all of them pretending to be secret histories recounted by means of anecdotes. One of the great bestsellers in this genre was the Private Life of Louis XV, or the Principal Events, Particularities, and Anecdotes of His Reign, published in 1781. I'm showing you a translation of this book, which was a bestseller in French, in the hopes that you can read the writing in the upper right. Can you read it? What's it say? George Washington, the father of our country, read this kind of trash. And so did everyone else. I mean, this book was read by everybody, especially in France. And I'm happy to say that the Harvard Library possesses George's copy of it. The other bestseller, Anecdotes secrètes sur Madame la Comtesse du Barry, Secret Anecdotes about Madame du Barry, elaborated on the notion of anecdotes. So I'd like to read its preface to you. Quote, although this work is a very complete life of Madame la Comtesse du Barry, the author has preferred to give it the modest title of Anecdotes in order to avoid every suggestion of pretentiousness. In this way, he has freed himself from the formal order and stylistic gravity that would have been required by a more imposing title. But no one should believe that by laboriously pulling together so much information, he has thoughtlessly included the large numbers of fables and absurdities which are recounted about this famous courtesan. As will be apparent, he cites evidence for everything that he asserts from her birth until her retirement. In this regard, he has observed the scrupulous role of an historian, end quote. Well, it's very verbose, and of course, he doesn't let his name appear anywhere, but it gets across the rhetorical strategy of these recounters of anecdotes. And sophisticated readers would not take this kind of sales talk seriously. Although anecdotes were defined as hidden truths, they were often understood to be half-truths. In fact, they sometimes presented themselves in this way, teasing the reader with winks and nudges that belong to a rhetorical game peculiar to many kinds of light literature in the 18th century, things like the roman à clef. So here is a note in a French chronique scandaleuse, scandalous chronicle, that informs the reader, tongue-in-cheek, quote, half of this article is true, end quote. Which half? Well, it's up to you, the reader, to decide. Now, where did anecdotes originate? Just in the same way as paragraphs in London, from gossip, rumor, and what the French call, I love this expression, public noises, bruit public. So the French equivalent of the English paragraph man was someone called a nouvelliste, a newsman who usually stationed himself in certain key places. There was a certain bench in the Luxembourg Gardens, or there was a tree of Krakow, as it was known, in the Palais Royal. There were certain tables in cafes. Everyone knew where to go if you wanted to gossip. And you see here gossips around a table in a cafe. Here you see the tree of Krakow, and they're exchanging information. One is reading from a news sheet. This is the Krakow tree, again, in the gardens of the Palais Royal. What these nouvellistes, newsmen, would do, they would pick up gossip in these certain places, then scribble it on a scrap of paper, usually a paragraph, just a few sentences. And then they would go home and compile the scraps of paper into bulletins, manuscript news sheets. And these manuscript news sheets, called nouvelles à la main, because they're manuscript, sometimes would be copied by servants. They had whole copying systems, and sold to subscribers everywhere in France and everywhere in Europe. We found some in Poland and Russia. So the whole business was illegal, but it was so widespread that the police tolerated relatively moderate nouvellistes and occasionally even collaborated with them. So there was a kind of semi-legal police gazette, a gazette meaning gazette à la main, that circulated as well. One protege of the police, a scribbler named Fouliou, always sat at a certain table in the Café du Caveau. The Café du Caveau was a great nerve center for gossip in the 18th century. And one day, the cops came and grabbed him and carried him off to the Bastille. And he said, well, why did you take me? I mean, I'm working with you. He was one of the police gazetteers. And he had written something in the Gazette that offended someone in Versailles, but he replied, and I've read his interrogation in the manuscripts of the Bastille. He said, I was doing nothing more than writing up the echo of public noises, of bruit public, end quote. So I mention this incident because it illustrates, I think, the importance of oral communication as a source of news. Strictly speaking, of course, information about current politics could not appear in print. France is completely different from England. There is elaborate censorship of everything, especially the press. There were foreign French language journals that were allowed in France, 15 of them by 1780, but they were censored too, and they could be cut off by not allowing them in the postal system. In other words, there's a very complex journalistic world that is different from the English one, but is dealing with the same kind of matter. There was an elaborate underground system of information, and the key ingredient in it was the anecdote, a witty remark, a doggerel poem, a tidbit of gossip, jotted down on a scrap of paper. And here is an actual photograph of one of these scraps of paper, which I find rather moving because I found it in the archives of the Bastille. When you were arrested, the first thing the police did when they got you in the Bastille was to frisk you. And they frequently found bits of paper in the pockets of these new prisoners. This is one example. But the police, the Parisians, collected such scraps of paper by the hundreds, by the thousands. And I've gone through, so to speak, scrapbooks of all kinds of anecdotes that have this common characteristic that I've been trying to describe. Then they got printed. And that's where you see a transition from oral communication to manuscript communication to print communication. there were lots of these scandalous gazettes scandaleuses, chroniques scandaleuses. They were big bestsellers. The most famous of them, at least today, was one of them called Mémoires secrets pour servir à l'histoire de la République des Lettres en France. It ran to 36 volumes. And it was described by a contemporary as, quote, a chain of anecdotes that pleases everyone. The public loves to see the foolishness and feebleness of princes, end quote. So what we've got are books made up of fragments, books made up of anecdotes. And I took the one that was one of the real great bestsellers, The Private Life of Louis XV, and I began as I read it and reread it and hearing references that I'd seen elsewhere. So here is an example of one page which was quarried out of an earlier work. You see on the right the work that was plagiarized, and on the left the same passage slightly modified to fit into the private life of Louis XV. So then I read further, and I found more and more little chunks, little tidbits that had been, it's an anachronism, but that had been plagiarized from a variety of other books. And the deeper and further I read into The Private Life of Louis XV, it's 4 volumes long. I mean, it's an extraordinary work. The more, if you call it that, plagiarism I found. So I took 50 pages of this book and tried to locate all the passages that were lifted from other books in the form of anecdotes. The bar graphs horizontally are colored to represent the sources that were pilfered in the creation of this book, and you can see that often you get several of them on the same page. And if you read it vertically, that represents 50 pages. The white spaces maybe represented original writing, but more probably represented works that I could not identify as having been plagiarized. So I think that we should imagine a whole world of hack writers living in garrets, putting together bits of paper and making them into manuscript books that were later printed. That this is an important industry, very widespread, and that it produced bestsellers to the general reading population. So pilfering was standard practice among the hack writers of Paris and London in the 18th century. And to call it plagiarism, really doesn't do justice to it. It was a process of quarrying fragments out of other texts, cobbling them together, a kind of creative bricolage. So I think the conventional concepts of author and of book don't fit into this early modern kind of literary production, nor do they fit the digital future, or at least the future as described by the science writer Kevin Kelly. Quote, "We'll cobble together new books from bits and pieces lifted out of old ones. Once digitized, books can be unraveled into single pages or be reduced further into snippets of a page. These snippets will be remixed into reordered books," end quote. And as Larry Lessig of the Harvard Law School puts it, we live in a cut and paste culture enabled by technology, end quote. So there is, this characteristic is alive and well in the digital age. To earlier critics like Walter Benjamin and Roland Barthes, the fragmentary qualities of literature corresponded to a modernistic way of apprehending the world. And they had not yet dreamt of computer science and the internet, which makes copy and paste, mix and mash activities very easy for ordinary people. But judging from the rampant copying of the 18th century, we may tend to exaggerate the divide between the early modern and the postmodern worlds. So, returning now to ways of writing under the old regime, I suggest that we imagine the authors of works like the private life of Louis XV, sitting in a garret covered with books, as you saw in that engraving from Hogarth. Now, I realize that this pertains to a particular strain of anonymous works, not to absolutely everything, of course, in the 18th century. But that production of books of this sort was gigantic. And I've read enough of it to be convinced that systematic study would reveal how anecdotes pass through these oral, written, and printed sources, gathering force and ultimately forming what I call a kind of political folklore which conveyed a collective sense of the nature of the French monarchy on the eve of the Revolution. Now, these are big claims, and I won't go into it in any more detail. I'd like to end by citing one last example. It comes from a terrific bestseller called Anecdotes about Madame la Comtesse du Barry, so I will quote it in full. Quote, "We," the author's anonymous but uses the we voice, "we find in the manuscript journal," that is, Nouvelle à la main, "that often guides us in assembling the facts of our history, an anecdote relating to the period of Madame du Barry's life that we are discussing. From it, one can infer what was then the general opinion of the public about her domination of the king. It appears under the date of March 20th, 1773. Now we get a quote within that quote. He's quoting from the manuscript Nouvelle. "The talk is all about an incident that the courtiers have carefully noted and that proves that Madame la Comtesse du Barry has not lost in favor or intimacy with her royal lover. His Majesty likes to brew his own coffee, and by this innocent occupation to relieve himself from the heavy demands of government." Louis was famous for never working at government at all. "Recently, when the coffee pot was on the fire and His Majesty's attention was occupied by something else, the coffee began to boil over, and the beautiful favorite cried out, 'Hey, France, look out, your coffee is buggering off.' Fou le camp," which is quite strong in French. It is said that this title of France is the familiar expression used by this lady inside the private petits appartements of Versailles. Such details should never be repeated outside of them, but they leak out owing to the malignity of the courtiers, end quote. Now this anecdote, which is one of the most famous from the 18th century, passed from gossip and manuscript bulletins into a best-selling book. And it made, of course, the monarchy look tawdry and ridiculous, not merely because it stressed the vulgarity of the royal mistress, who, as it recounted in another chapter, began life as a prostitute, but also because domestic servants were often called by the name of their home province. So by calling the king La France, that is for the Île-de-France, Pompadour, or rather du Barry, was treating him as her lackey. Now, the coffee spilling anecdote really is one of the best known from the old regime, and it's still alive in the collective memory. I found this image a few years ago from a French-Canadian comic book. The artist got the mistress wrong. She was not Madame de Pompadour, she was Madame du Barry, but he got the message absolutely right. The message I want to convey concerns the fragmentary nature of information and the way it was reworked in communication systems. Those systems have differed enormously throughout history. So I'm not claiming that 18th century anecdotes and 20th century or 21st century blogs are the same thing. In fact, I'm arguing the opposite. By noticing their similarities, we can understand their differences. They had a common property, fragmentation, but they conveyed messages by the way they figured as fragments in profoundly different information ecologies. by consulting the blogosphere, I think we can appreciate an aspect of communication history which has never been studied, in fact, never even noticed. Thank you.